Anyone who works overtime and is slow at their job is just incompetent and should be fired. After that, a problem arose. Who's in charge here? He got fired yesterday. He was the only one who could speak French. What? There was only one person who could solve the problem. Michael tried to call him back, but my name is Brandon and I'm 30 years old. Despite being in my 30s, I live a brilliant life as a bachelor. My family home, where my parents and brother live, is about an hour drive away. We have a good family relationship, and I visit home about once a month. I work in sales, and I've been with my current company for 6 years. When I first joined, there was so much to learn that I struggled every day. At one point, I was recognized for smoothly handling a client who only spoke French, and I became in charge of foreign clients. It seemed I was the only one in the office who could speak French at a native level, so naturally, my workload increased. Before I knew it, working overtime had become the norm for me. Although physically exhausting, I could keep going because my colleague Jason and others would help out, bring me snacks, and cheer me on. There's nothing I can do to help. I'm sorry you have to bear all this burden. Some coworkers apologized, showing concern for me. The workload was immense, but I felt blessed with good relationships. Knowing that my efforts were helping my colleagues gave me more motivation. In the end, I actually liked my job. One day, as usual, I was working overtime when my manager Michael came to me. "You're working late every day. Don't tell me you're doing it on purpose to increase your overtime pay," Michael said. He was a bit of an eccentric, and even his colleagues tended to keep their distance from him. "I wouldn't do that. It's just that I have so many calls to make that I can't finish during regular hours," I responded. "Do you know what that's called?" "Incompetence," he said, snorting in a condescending manner. "If I could, I'd love to go home on time and just relax," I explained. But my workload was double that of other employees. Additionally, some clients were in different time zones, and it would be rude not to call them during their daytime hours. So, working overtime was inevitable to manage my workload. "I'm sorry, but to avoid causing trouble to other employees' work, please let me continue a bit longer," I apologized politely. Michael left with a click of his tongue. I wondered what Michael was doing so late, but then remembered I was in the middle of work and resumed. The next day, thanks to me, the documents for today's presentation would be ready just in time. "Always grateful to you, Brandon," I heard. "I heard that the presentation you did the other day went well. Great job. Other employees would thank me like this every day. Just hearing words of thanks and praise made all the hard work feel worthwhile." "I'm honored to be of help," I responded. With such positive feedback, I was able to start my workday with great motivation. "Then you should leave on time once in a while. I know you have a lot of work, but remember that taking breaks is also part of the job," Jason advised. Heeding his advice, I decided to leave early for once. Thinking of going home early, I sent a text message to my parents. "Can I come over today? I'm getting off work on time for a change." The reply came quicker than expected. "Of course. It's been a while, so I'll cook your favorite dishes and wait for you." Thinking of having a delicious meal instead of a ready-made one tonight made me even more motivated, and I was able to focus more than usual on my work. I thought I had done enough to not trouble anyone, and when I looked at the clock, it was just past the regular closing time. Quickly preparing to leave, I greeted the remaining employees and was about to exit the company when Michael stopped me. "Leaving now? You always work late, don't you?" he said in his usual sarcastic tone. "Yes, I finished the minimum required tasks for today, so I'll be leaving now. I responded with a smile, not letting Michael's sarcasm bother me. However, Michael didn't seem amused. "Who said you could leave?" he said, and I heard the sound of papers falling. Michael had knocked all the documents off my desk. "Whoops, my bad," he said, grinning. "Seems like my hand slipped." Looking at Michael's face, it was obvious he did it on purpose. "Oopsie, I accidentally stepped on them," he continued, deliberately stepping on the fallen documents, and left with a loud, crude laugh. I was genuinely worried and quickly started picking up the papers. Employees who had witnessed the whole thing helped me, and we managed to gather all the documents, but it was clear they needed sorting as various papers were mixed up. "We'll handle this. Brandon, just go home, man." My colleagues concerned for me urged me to leave. But there were too many documents, and they would end up working overtime. "Thanks, but I'm fine." "I'll do it and go home. You all have other work, right?" I said with a smile. They insisted on helping, and thanks to them, we finished much faster than expected. However, when I checked the time, it was already 2 hours past the regular closing time, and I had several worried messages from my mom. I hadn't noticed because my phone was in my bag. I apologized as I messaged back. "Work suddenly got busy and it's late. I'll drop by on my next day off. I'm really sorry, especially after you prepared dinner." I sighed with regret as I messaged back. "It's okay, as long as you're safe. I was worried something had happened." "Come by any time," my mom replied. Reading my mom's reply, I felt a bit calmer and headed home. After the overtime incident, Michael seemed to have targeted me, and his childish harassment continued for a while. I was ordered to redo documents for being unclear, and was the only one not receiving company emails. His blatant harassment led to my colleagues often stepping in to help, but the mental strain and stress were gradually building up. With the additional workload and Michael's harassment, I often worked until the last train. Then one day, while working overtime alone, Michael came again. By now, Michael was a figure of caution for me, and I felt myself tense up. "What is it? What do you mean?" I asked, and Michael's usual condescending tone came through. "Do you even realize how incompetent you are, just scraping off overtime pay?" He said. "I apologize. I'll leave now," I said, starting to prepare to leave. "No, there's no need for you to come back," Michael said with a laugh. "What? Anyone who stays late and is slow at their job is just incompetent and shall be fired." Suddenly confronted with this, I stood there unable to grasp the meaning of Michael's words. "What do you mean?" I managed to speak, my voice strained, and Michael laughed as if pleased. "I mean incompetence is a nuisance. You don't have to come back, you're fired. Don't make me say it again." Michael left the company with a loud, unpleasant laugh. "I'm fired," I muttered to myself, left alone. After sitting dazed in the office for a while, I realized I had missed the last train and had to take a taxi home. As I looked out of the car window, I thought about the tasks I had to do tomorrow. I need to prepare the contract for ABC Corporation and the presentation documents too. I have to stay late tomorrow, so I can't miss the last train. Is it an occupational habit? Without realizing, I started organizing my tasks for the next day in my head. Then it hit me. "Oh, that's right. I got fired," I muttered, looking at the moon. The taxi driver asked me to repeat. "It's nothing," I replied with a forced smile and got out of the taxi at my house. I was so drained that I just collapsed onto my bed as soon as I got home. I was so mentally exhausted that, unusually, I woke up before my alarm clock went off. I usually get up at 7 a.m, but it was only 5 a.m. when I checked the time. I tried to go back to sleep, but Michael's words, "You're fired," kept echoing in my ears, preventing me from sleeping. I knew I had to start looking for a new job, but it wasn't easy to just move on, so I just lay there under the covers. As time passed, how much time had passed? I realized my phone had been ringing continuously. I picked up the phone, and it was a colleague, but I didn't feel like answering. I gently placed the phone back down. It was past 10 a.m. when I checked the time. I hadn't noticed it was bright outside as the curtains were closed. I wondered what my colleagues thought about me being fired. Were they angry? Were some of them happy? Was I as incompetent as Michael had said? The incident had broken my spirit, and I could only think negatively. I have been so devoted to my job, more than I realized. Even when I was a newbie, running around to the point of nearly breaking down, I had never felt this low. Lost in my thoughts, I was startled by the sudden ringing of the doorbell. Who could it be? I slowly got up and peered through the door's peephole, and it was my father. I was momentarily surprised and hesitated to open the door. Then the doorbell rang again. With trembling hands, I slowly opened the door, and my father smiled upon seeing my face. What kind of face is that? At those words, tears started flowing, and before I knew it, they were streaming down my face. I'm coming in, saying that my father entered, holding a plastic bag. Seeing me in my wrinkled suit, he lifted the bag he was holding. "Want to eat? You probably haven't eaten anything, right?" So, my father knew. I felt so pathetic. He entered the room and opened the curtains immediately. Perhaps it was because I had been in a dark room for a while. The sunlight felt unusually bright, perhaps brighter than usual. The company called. They said you weren't answering your phone, so they contacted our home. What happened? I explained the whole situation to my father. He listened, nodding along as I spoke. "So, what do you want to do now?" asked my father. I was unable to gather my thoughts and could only hang my head. What should I do now? What should I be thinking? How should I act? Seeing me like this, my father began to speak. Don't deny yourself just because others do. What's important is not what you should do, but what you want to do. People's words can sometimes be sharper than a blade, right? But don't let such people mislead you about your own worth. Nobody can truly determine another person's value. You've done well. Stand tall and be proud. Hearing my father's words, I found myself crying again. My father patted my back reassuringly. "Let's have some food. It's your mom's cooking. If we don't eat, I'll get scolded by her." The thought made me chuckle a little. I had finally managed to smile. I ate the meal prepared by my mother with my father. Her cooking was as delicious as ever. I had lost my appetite since yesterday, but once I started eating, I was surprised at how hungry I actually was. Hunger doesn't let the mind focus. Forward for now. Just eat well and rest. Things will surely look up. I never thought that at this age I would be comforted by my father. Perhaps age doesn't matter in a family. If my father hadn't come, I would probably still be in bed, not eating, not moving, just spiraling in negative thoughts. Feeling full helped me start looking forward again. After finishing the meal, my father said, "You can always come back home." And then he left my place. Sitting on my bed after he left, I began to think about the future. Even if I was as incompetent as Michael said, I wasn't satisfied with how things ended. I don't demand recognition for my hard work, but I refuse to believe that everything, what I did was in vain. After all, it was Michael who announced my dismissal. What would Mr. Johnson think about this? It felt unsatisfying to just leave things as they were. Acknowledging Michael's actions, I wanted to retaliate, even if in a small way. While I was thinking, my phone rang again. Looking at the display, it was another colleague. After hesitating, I decided to answer. "Hello," I said. As soon as I answered, I heard my colleague's loud voice. "Finally, you answered. You got fired. What's going on?" Exactly what I wanted to know. I told my colleague about last night's incident with Michael. "What? That's crazy, Michael." "You should have talked back," my colleague responded, strangely indignant on my behalf. It was a bit amusing and touching to see him angry at me. I asked my colleague about what happened at the office today and how the employees were reacting. His story wandered a bit, but the gist of it was this. In the morning assembly, a few employees noticed my absence and were discussing contacting me when Michael overheard and laughed, saying I was fired. When asked why, he refused to say, citing it as personal information. What kind of personal information is that? My colleagues and superiors, suspecting unfair dismissal due to Michael's involvement, planned to consult Mr. Johnson, but he was on a business trip. They decided to speak with Mr. Johnson as soon as he returned from his trip, but many were concerned about me and had tried calling. "I was about to go to your house if you didn't respond even by tomorrow," my colleague said. Hearing the story, I realized again how fortunate I was with my workplace relationships. "Thank you. I'm glad to hear it," I said. As I said this, my colleague panicked, misunderstanding my tone. "What's with that ominous remark? You're not thinking of doing something drastic, are you?" I couldn't help but laugh at his words. It's not funny. "Seriously, what are you going to do now?" "Right. What am I going to do regarding my dismissal?" I need to understand the company's stance, so talking to Mr. Johnson is essential. But I didn't want to let Michael have the last word. While thinking, something occurred to me. What's happening with my work? Yesterday, I left work without finishing my tasks. There were documents I was supposed to use. Today, I feel irresponsible, but I'm curious to know what happened. Well, actually, I wanted to talk to you about that too. The documents we were supposed to use today, you had mostly prepared them, right? My colleague asked. All that was left was a detailed part of the contract translation into French. Other employees were trying to complete it, but then Michael suddenly said, "I'll do it." Hearing this, I was surprised. Michael was known for pushing work onto others, but never doing it himself. So Michael ended up doing it. It was finished just in time, and we hastily sent it to the client by email. But remember that time when Michael did a translation, and it was a mess? We were also worried. Previously, Michael had claimed, "I can handle French," and prepared a contract in French, but it resulted in a complaint from the client. This was before I joined the team, so I hadn't seen it myself, but long-standing employees told me it was a big issue. And that worry became a reality. My colleague explained what happened today. It seems like something like this happened. "Michael, there's a call from a foreign company." I could only catch your name but couldn't understand the rest. "Sorry, should I transfer the call to you?" "Come on, learn to speak French." "Just transfer it," Michael said. He answered the call and said in poor French, "Hi, I'm Michael. How are you?" "One more time," the caller requested. Again, is that even real French? Michael hesitated. "Why angry contract?" "What?" Sorry, hello." He spoke in what seemed to be French, but then he said they hung up. "What did they say?" I asked. "Oh, they said they wanted to contract." "No problem," Michael replied. But later, another call came in. The client was furious, saying the contract was so poorly done, it was unacceptable. That contract had been prepared by Michael, and French. My colleague interrupted. "Who's in charge of this? Get them to solve it." "He got fired yesterday. He was the only one who could speak French," my colleague explained. I sighed after hearing my colleague's explanation. I haven't seen the contents of the contract, but the fact that they're so upset is proof that it must have been pretty shoddy. And Michael's handling of it just made things worse. It feels like pouring gasoline on the fire. "It must have been tough." "I'm sorry," my colleague said. "It was my job," I replied. I couldn't think of anything else to say. I wondered if there was anything I could do, but then I remembered I was no longer in a position to be involved. I realized my dismissal was causing trouble for my colleagues. I was plagued with guilt. "It's not your fault, Brandon. Your workload was already too much. It's our responsibility too for not being able to support you. Actually, is it Michael to blame?" I felt comforted by my colleague's words and found myself wanting to return to the company. "Even if I decide to leave, I still want to talk to Mr. Johnson," I said. According to my colleague, Mr. Johnson would be back from his trip in 2 days. I decided to prepare what I would discuss with him. For now, I needed to collect my belongings from the office. So I informed my colleague that I would be coming by tomorrow. He said he would let the supervisor know, and we ended the call. The next day, I went to the company to get my things. Despite being familiar with the route from years of commuting, I felt nervous. Today, when I arrived at the company, my colleagues gathered around, showing their concern for me. "I'm sorry I couldn't be of help," Jason said, looking frustrated. I told him that it wasn't his fault and assured my colleagues that I was fine. When I mentioned I came to collect my belongings, their expressions turned complex. They seriously considered if there was any way for me to return, showing that they valued my presence. While talking, Michael approached and looked displeased upon seeing me. "Why are you here?" "This area is restricted to authorized personnel only," Michael said. "I just came to collect my belongings that I left here." "I'll be leaving soon," I replied. As I headed towards my desk, Michael loudly called out from behind, "Good timing. Take responsibility for your work before you leave." I turned around at that line. Could he be trying to pin yesterday's incident on me? "What do you mean?" I asked. As I asked, Michael smirked. "Your half-finished contract caused an uproar with a foreign client. Take responsibility," Michael said, oblivious to the appalled expressions around him. He continued to blame me, and I wondered how far he would go to cause trouble, just as my anger was reaching its limit. Enough already. A familiar voice spoke, and I turned to see Mr. Johnson standing there. Mr. Johnson. The employees were also surprised to see him. He was supposed to return from his business trip tomorrow. Michael visibly panicked at Mr. Johnson's appearance. "Mr. Johnson, you were scheduled to return tomorrow." Watching Michael speak with agitation, Mr. Johnson sighed. "I came back early after hearing about the trouble. So what's all this commotion about?" Mr. Johnson's anger was evident to everyone. Understandably, the employees fell silent, making the office quiet. Even though I was fired, I had wanted to talk to Mr. Johnson. I thought this might be the perfect opportunity, but it didn't seem like the right time to speak up. Shouldn't the commotion be explained and guidance sought? But perhaps as someone who's been fired, it wasn't my place to say anything. Amid a loud ticking of the clock, Mr. Johnson spoke again. "What's this commotion about?" "Tell me, Michael." Michael became even more unsettled when he was called out by name. However, with a slice of smoke, as if having thought of something, Michael began to explain to Mr. Johnson. This guy here, he made a sloppy contract that led to a complaint from a foreign client. I was just lecturing him about it. He always works late, and I thought maybe he was doing it on purpose to increase his overtime pay. So I fired him yesterday. I told him to take responsibility for this mess before he quits. Michael presented himself as if he were doing the right thing. I felt a renewed contempt for him, realizing once again how self-centered he was. Although I didn't want to be attacked by Mr. Johnson, it might be an opportunity to explain my side. If he didn't believe me, it could be a valid reason for leaving. Just as I was about to take a gamble and speak up, Mr. Johnson intervened. "Is that so? Then, Brandon, come to my office." Suddenly, I was filled with tension, but this gave me an opportunity to have a private conversation with Mr. Johnson. Looking at Mr. Johnson, his face was no longer stern, but had a gentle smile. Yes, I left my belongings on the desk and followed Mr. Johnson into his office. It serves him right. This will save me. Upon entering the president's office, Mr. Johnson opened the window. A silent pressure weighed in the air, creating an atmosphere that made it difficult for me to speak. I waited for Mr. Johnson to say something first. I wondered if I was going to be reprimanded, bombarded with questions, or possibly even faced with discussions about damages or compensation. It's a story from about 20 years ago, before this company was founded. Back then, I worked at a regular corporation. I exclaimed, surprised by the unexpected start of his story. Seeing Mr. Johnson's face, it was no longer the intimidating look from before, but a gentle smile. I was about your age back then. I was struggling with work, no matter how hard I tried, disliked by my boss, and on the verge of giving up. That's when a senior colleague told me, "Don't let anyone else's disapproval bring you down. You're doing great. Stand tall and be proud." I was struck by Mr. Johnson's words. They sounded so familiar. "Those words," I murmured. Mr. Johnson laughed heartily. "How's your dad doing?" I was stunned. Could it be that Mr. Johnson and my father know each other? I had never heard about this. I was so surprised that I couldn't speak, but Mr. Johnson continued, "Your father's words inspired me to persevere and eventually establish this company. In a way, he's my benefactor. When you joined the company, your father contacted me, asking me to look after his son. I didn't reveal our connection to prevent you from becoming complacent or feeling pressured. I hope you understand." Before I knew it, Mr. Johnson's kind words had eased my tension, and I felt a sense of happiness. I realized I had been watching over all this time. "Yes, thank you so much." As I said that, Mr. Johnson gave me a warm smile. "About the recent matter, I reviewed the documents and contract you sent to the client. On my way back to the office, it was clearly made by someone else, so I know you weren't the cause. And about Michael firing you, I won't let that happen. If you're willing, I want you to continue working with us. What do you say?" It seemed like Mr. Johnson had seen right through what I wanted to discuss. I respected the insight of someone at the top of the company. Of course, please let me keep working here. Maybe I'm simple-minded. Feeling relieved brought back my confidence. I was truly happy to continue working here. That's a good response. I apologize for making you feel anxious and uncomfortable. It was not my intention, Mr. Johnson apologized. I was flustered and surprised. It wasn't Mr. Johnson's fault. I knew that and had no complaints against him. "I never wanted you to apologize." "Sorry." I apologized reflexively, and Mr. Johnson chuckled. Why are you apologizing? You haven't done anything wrong. I've heard about your good work. I want you here, not because of my debt to your father, but because you're a capable employee. Please understand. I learned how much being acknowledged can bring happiness and confidence. My eyes welled up with tears, perhaps because of the emotional strain. Mr. Johnson said I could leave, and I exited his office. When I stepped out, all eyes were on me. It seemed I had caused quite a worry. I smiled and gave a thumbs up, and my colleagues cheered with joy. A co-worker patted my shoulder, saying they were glad for me. My tears were slightly visible, and when they teased me about crying, I retorted that I wasn't. I was smiling. When suddenly I heard yelling. No way. Amidst the excitement, Michael stood with wide eyes and an angry expression. How is this possible? Are you staying? What about your responsibility in the overtime pay? I decided you were fired. Michael's fury was no longer a threat to me. Ignoring him felt easier as I chatted with my colleagues. His anger intensified as he marched towards me. Don't ignore me. I'm the department head. We don't need someone like you. Get out now. Oh my, this isn't very calm. Mr. Johnson emerged from his office, hearing Michael's shouts. Michael demanded an explanation from him. What's going on? What about his responsibility for the client incident? You haven't reversed his firing, have you? Michael continued to shout angrily at Mr. Johnson. We all watched, more nervous than him. You don't have the authority to fire an employee, and wasn't it you who messed up the contract? Mr. Johnson spoke calmly, halting Michael's momentum. Silent and head down, Michael began to tremble. I don't understand what you mean. I didn't do anything. I'm not involved, still trying to deny it. At this point, his audacity was impressive, but not enviable. He desperately didn't want to admit his fault. As Michael denied it, I wondered what Mr. Johnson would say. Then, surprisingly, another employee spoke up. That contract was made by Michael. I'm sure, to my surprise, one of the employees started to testify, leading the way. Other employees also started testifying. I heard Michael ordering the contract to be sent by email. I heard Michael trying to communicate with the client in French, which he couldn't speak properly. I heard it too. It was clear from the conversation that it wasn't going well at all. Michael was taken aback by the successive employee testimonies, but when he shouted, "Shut up!" everyone fell silent. It was remarkable how much disdain he had garnered as a professional, and it was questionable how someone like him could be a department head. I felt a newfound closeness to Mr. Johnson, and considered asking him about it later. Michael, why don't you just accept it gracefully? You're making a bad situation worse. As I said this, Michael turned beet red with anger. It was nothing but a tantrum, and he kept insisting he was not at fault. But Mr. Johnson put an end to this blame-shifting plan. However, we have surveyed footage and computer data history that clearly show your involvement. So, no matter what you say, you're fired. Struck by the final blow, he fell silent and froze for a moment. And then Michael crumbled to his knees. Finally, he was quiet. He muttered in a low voice, sweating profusely. This wasn't supposed to happen. You'll receive a formal notice later. Go home for today. Eventually, Michael gathered his things and left dejectedly. Thus, the matter was concluded. Afterwards, Michael was fired. It turned out Michael was a distant relative of Mr. Johnson, and Mr. Johnson had been asked to look after him because Michael couldn't hold down a job. Michael had been taking credit for others' work and got promoted to department head. Mr. Johnson admitted it was his responsibility for not seeing through it and expressed his need for self-reflection. Losing his job, Michael entered a self-destructive phase and resorted to gambling. Soon, he couldn't pay his rent and was evicted. In a panic, he found a job with a dormitory, but the shared bathroom and thin walls, with complaints about any noise, made it tough. As for me, I returned to work the next day. My colleague's welcome back gift was a pile of work, just as I expected. But now, I am happy to be busy again. When I was getting into the swing of things, Mr. Johnson came by and limited my overtime to 3 days a week. When I asked why, it seemed that my father had expressed concern, asking, "Aren't you making him work too much overtime?" I was a bit dismayed to have my father involved at this age, but I knew he was concerned about me. With reduced overtime, I started visiting my parents more often. My mother and brother, worried about the recent events, treated me as if nothing had happened, which I greatly appreciated. Later, I learned that my mother was childhood friends with Mr. Johnson. She had wanted to complain to him about the overtime in the recent incident, but my father had calmed her down. My brother had been fired up about taking action against Michael, but again, my father had intervened. This whole situation made me realize how many people were on my side, making me feel fortunate, though maybe a bit overprotective. Later on, I became the training supervisor for a newly hired female employee, which led to starting a relationship. Another important person was added to my life. I now want to be someone who protects others, and that's how I'm living my life.